I want to say hi to everybody there and say how much I wish I was with you. I think this conference is incredibly important, and I really appreciate how Stevens Institute of Technology has foregrounded the urgency of architectural education. I also want to thank Graham Kearns for asking me to be a keynote. I feel that that comes with certain obligations that I'm not positive that I can live up to, but I really appreciate the opportunity to try and pull together thoughts on issues that I think conflate and really matter to architectural education. So it's been my pleasure to think this through. When I was first asked to do this, I suggested that I would offer, as this talk, the ideal 3-year Masters of Architecture curriculum. I couldn't do that in the end. It was too much of a straitjacket. But I also came to think that it was maybe an answer to the wrong question. An answer to the wrong question because the nature of architectural education is rhizomatic, all over the place, penetrates many disciplines, is impure. And I've come to admire and want to encourage that impurity. So what I have here is a list of opinions. I couldn't even actually make this talk be a discursive, logical argument, but I'm hoping that within this set of opinions, there's room to think through and speculate about how we all might work together to implement a new program of architectural education. I also want to acknowledge the kind of collective intelligence that is behind my opinions here. In particular, I want to thank the members of the architecture lobby whose different campaigns, particularly those working with the Green New Deal, have contributed very, very significantly to what I'm thinking about here. But I also want to thank those who are working on the Green New Deal for their systemic way of thinking about the problem of ecology and its relationship to politics and economics. It's been a model for how to think about architectural education. So let me just describe then how I will go through the talk. I'm going to start with the issues that the world hands us, and then go to the profession to think about how the profession can deliver architectural citizens who are up to the challenges of that world, and then go to architectural education to think about how we can deliver people to the profession equal to those world issues. So, the world. The world has handed us what I think of as the big 4 issues: climate change, housing, technology, and the true, not anti-unionist, right to work. These problems need little elaboration, but nevertheless, I want to put them in a contextual context that might be meaningful for us architects. So, climate change. Rectifying climate change and energy consumption is not primarily scientifically or technologically driven, it is socially driven. This means that we need to adopt new ways of relating to one another as much as relating to the built environment. This means 2 things: that we need to reconceive how we think of the production of the built environment, but we also need to reconceive the consumption of the products that we do in that built environment. Yes, the physical infrastructure that we produce needs our attention, and architects need to be part of that infrastructural discussion, but also we need to think about the fact that we're in a position to construct the communities that operate within those infrastructures. We need to construct the commons. Housing. Housing is a right, not a privilege, full stop. In addressing this, we also need to learn from our past mistakes, where our infrastructural work and our ideas about housing has displaced communities, and in particularly displaced communities of color. We also need to think about the connection of how we house our own citizens to the question of how we can house immigrants and refugees. And if we architects think that we can maybe address the one, our citizens, and not the other, which is refugees and immigrants, I think we need to remember that the same politics that makes it seem impossible to house our citizens in our richest cities are the same policies that make it impossible, seemingly, to address the immigrant and refugee housing problem. Technology. Technological innovation has been thrust upon us by the knowledge economy and market demands. We may not like that, but nevertheless, the technologies, even without the thrust of innovation, are here to stay, and we need to understand them and control them instead of them controlling us. Technologies are not abstractions, they are not neutral, but they are, first and foremost, embedded in social structures. And the fact that they are embedded in social structures means that the way to redirect technologies is by changing the social relations within which they are embedded. Technologies are changeable, they are rhizomatic, they change fluidly. We need to be part of that change, and we need to direct that change in the right direction. On the enthusiastic side, we want to encourage those technologies that allow us to share knowledge, to coordinate data, design, remediation, and construction. On the cautious side, we want to ask who owns these technologies and what are they doing with the profits? Are these technologies necessary? Who do they displace? Who has access to them? Work. We all have the right to true work. And yes, the architecture lobby has made the issue of architectural work part of its foregrounding and foregrounded campaign. In some way, this feels like a new discussion, but in reality, it might be new to architecture, but it's not new to society and to a society of just and social democratic access. I want to read then the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23. This states, 1, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protect against unemployment. Everyone, without discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplemented, if necessary, with other means of social protection. And 4, everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests. I hope it's obvious that this is the realm in which gender and intersectionality play out. Work is the sphere that can most abuse these identities and, if rectified, support true subjective identities. We also need to understand that to divide the workers according to different categories, whether those are racial, economic, gendered, is a mistake, inasmuch as we workers have much more in common with each other than we do with those who profit off of our unpaid labor. More than anything, we workers need to know that when we band together, we can eventually own the means of production. So, moving on then to the profession. Architecture's ability to address these issues then is the litmus test for a successful profession and the education that precedes it. So here are 7 observations. 1, the profession is more with it than the academy. The profession has had a front row seat to neoliberalism's changing demands for innovation. They've developed tools that the academy has ignored or only implemented with anxiety. This is to say, CAD/CAM, BIM, integrated project delivery, ecological apps, augmented reality, 3D printing, robots. All of these innovations shine a light on the issues that we architects can affect. 2, we can admire the profession's progress on various efficiencies and the technologies that have allowed them, but we can still criticize the use to which these efficiencies and technologies are put, which is to say, put in the advantage of the developers who hand us our jobs and don't actually in any way allow us to implement better jobs. Designing buildings that are merely decorating a commodity is not what we want to be doing. And our willingness to accept our marginal role in the shaping of our environment needs to be fought. Again, designing a commodity is not what we want to be doing. Many of the most talented and intelligent graduates of architecture schools are not going to work in traditional architectural offices because they know that their work, their knowledge, their intelligence, their skills will have nothing to do with any social relevance to which they aspire. 3, we must broaden our political commitment. We may not ever be able to stop private property, but we might be able to argue against private development. The U.S. is alone in the developed countries that has private developments that are financed by private development by over 50%. Indeed, 70% of all projects in the U.S. are private development. In Europe, the average is 35%. Nor do we want to encourage the stepping back or the possible better set of circumstances that rely on public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are the worst of both worlds, which is to say we don't have the advantage of a government that looks out for social interests because they defer to market demands of the private developers. And we can't vote with our feet, which would be the case in a true market-driven economy, to say that we don't want to live in commodities in the communities that are being delivered to us because the government protects them. We also need to throw our weight around every time there is a political proposal that touches ecology, housing, technological power, or labor. If only the AIA could take stands within the political arena that match the AMA, which sued the Trump administration for the administration's Title IX family rule, which defunds abortion clinics. 4, we need to broaden our professional catchment, which is to say our professional MO right now is protective, defensive, narrow, and risk-averse. We can't share knowledge with disciplines that extend our sphere of influence and our knowledge base if we're telling them that they are excluded from our exceptionalism. Licensing is a problem. I look in this case to the Swedes that have no licensing. Anybody can call themselves an architect in Sweden. They also have an association, which is to say a union of workers that includes all design disciplines, interior design, landscape design, planning, such that the association can argue for the advancement of education across all of those disciplines and connects those disciplines to the community, but also speaks for those professions within the government. I will also just point out that the association has done a survey and have identified the fact that Swedish architects make more money than any other European architects, which is clearly to say the professional protection does not equal more pay. 5, we also need to be discriminating in our catchment, which is to say we need to reconceive our agency beyond design. We need to think about withholding our labor, about refusing to engage in building programs that perpetuate inequality. But we also should think about refusing to compete against other firms. Despite antitrust laws in the U.S. that demand competition, there are no laws that suggest that we can't share knowledge, share workers, share strategies, share profits. In some way, we all need to fight the marginalization of the architectural profession together. 6, we must broaden our sphere of knowledge, which is to say we need to work with organizations that are already on the ground, activist groups, nonprofits, think tanks. Many of these organizations have funding from the government and from private organizations, philanthropic, that offer money that architects will never see, and we need to work with them and take advantage of their funding. I also think that the AIA should help us in these connections. It should not be up to every single individual firm to think about those connections and the groups that are on the ground and are better funded. It is the AIA's role to make those connections for us. 7, we need to reconceive the nature of what we do, which is to say we need to understand that we design scenarios, not objects. This is different than suggesting that we want to do more than decorate buildings, which suggests that we want to have an influence on the programs that are handed to us. But the idea that we design scenarios indicates that it's not the programs themselves that determine the object. Our main task is asking and trying to answer these questions. Who is physically or symbolically allowed in one space versus another? And with what equipment? How and when do we encourage connection? what powers, other than our spatial ones that we might control, are at play in these exclusions or incorporations? And how can we act as a bridge between those forces and the communities that we are working for? So, then on to education. Architecture education has always been the ideal to the profession's real. The academy is seen as speculative and idealist, the profession constrained and stuck. But now the academy is not so interesting and I think is more stuck. So here are 7 thoughts about architectural education. 1, the academy is stuck first in its contents, which is to say, its pride in its sovereignty over formal innovation. That pride and that sovereignty doesn't matter anymore, and in any case, its moment has passed. I think that interest in aesthetic sovereignty is an attempt to address modernism's failed social programs by sublimating it to aesthetic redemption. But this 61 plus years of aesthetic redemption has failed, and we need to move on. 2, it is also stuck in its methodology. We need to move beyond the Beaux-Arts tradition that privileges studio, charrettes, competition, design virtuosity, heroic programs, the emphasis on precedence, and the honoring of past masters. This pedagogy was specific to its era. Durand's system of compositional gridding was a strategy for handling unprecedented and newly complex building programs. The Grand Prix-dominated pedagogy conformed to an era of governmental patronage. And Viollet-le-Duc's structural rationalism responded to the new materials and construction trades introduced by industrialization. These moments have passed. This era is gone. We now must respond to our era, one shaped by neoliberal economics and oligarchic politics. 3, we need to recognize that our precious view of design and supposed implementation in small boutique firms is increasingly provincial. We need to recognize the multiscalar ways that the world is actually constructing the built environment. And we miss this intersected multiscalar aspect of the profession at our peril. We must recognize that construction in China, in the Emirates, for example, where access to cheap labor and techno-political prowess makes cities overnight. The only efficacy of small firms is their ability to weave into local networks, but that efficacy means nothing if we're individuating and thinking about the star quality and the aesthetic beauty of our individual products from those individual firms. The efficacy of the small firms really only matters if they work cooperatively to build the communal commons. 4, instituting a research-based architectural academy means replacing or redirecting studio's hegemony. Studio must either absorb the historical, cultural, economic, ecological, political, technological, and representational dimensions surrounding design decisions, or, in this absorption, no longer be recognizable as studio. So, then, rethinking those subjects as we now have them. Design matters, but it matters not for the objects we produce, but for the scenarios we offer. Again, how do we want people to gather, separate, perform, agitate, retreat, rest, etc.? Thinking about scenarios instead of the aesthetic aspect of the object ensures that we can no longer think of the forms as neutral with regard to subjectivity. Beatrice Colomina's work on Los, I feel, has indicated how Los's round plan was really basically a setup for who controls the gaze, who is the subject of the gaze, who will bypass one another, who will meet, and who will where, and where will that happen. I also think of Keller Easterling's projects that she was teaching at Yale, where I was privileged to watch, where she was teaching about how refugees can organize through technological advances their different capabilities of working, of organizing, of moving, and establishing self-havens. Design then matters as well because we design the procurement process. Who do you gather as the team to deliver the project, and what labor and resources have been called upon to make it work? In this idea of design, formal aptitude is a subset, but it is a foundational one. Form is a language that we speak, and if we don't speak it well, nobody will listen. But how is this taught within a research-based pedagogy? This isn't clear to me, but there are some things I know. It won't take up 3/4 of our point system. It won't be governed by be-all and end-all juries. It won't privilege aesthetic dexterity over the nature of the subject matter, and it will be taught in collaborative teams as well as the individual subject. Professional practice courses, traditionally the hinge between academic speculation and the seemingly limited real world, will disappear. All years, in some sense, will be practicing what our métier has to offer. And in another sense, it will disappear in as much as the traditional content, normative contracts, responsibilities, business plans, liability, licensure, is no longer our preferred horizon. Changing them is. If history in the aftermath of post-criticality and the embrace of neoliberalism has dominated our last 25 years of history theory, theory comes forward. When studio and design have ignored issues of gender, labor, colonialism, Eurocentrism, and racism and climate change, theorists have stepped in. I particularly admire right now eFlux's series, Theories Curriculum, where different people have contributed curriculums that really identify the fact that they are taking the leading role in changing our architectural education. They're clear about the need to move beyond our aesthetic paradigms. They also are reconceiving what theory curriculum actually looks like, which is to say that they are now putting forth categories such as property, labor, the particular, the universal, alienation, bodies. I admire these new curriculum. We teach technologies that make us more intelligent and collaborative, not just efficient, and we do these in a way that will not just be begrudgingly learned because we have to get a job when we graduate. BIM is taught not as a system of production, but as a way of rethinking how and with whom we design. Coding is as necessary as hand drawing. AI, VR, and AR are embraced to the extent that they emphasize the democratic access to decision making. But we also need to study the potential effects of technology on automation. If indulging technological innovation means the displacement of workers, we need to study how to reskill those displaced workers. I'm thinking not just of the laborers and the construction people who build our buildings, I'm thinking about ourselves. If we are thinking about the construction workers, yes, it is our responsibility to think about them, since our work is primarily the aim of coordinating between our intentions and their execution. If it's executed in different ways or with different types of labor, we need to care for the manner in which that work is now being done or what they're going to do in the new economy. I also think that we need to think beyond and more specifically than just vague gestures towards universal basic income, which basically assumes that we are not going to work, which I don't think is the ideal society. And 7, I want the Architectural Academy to become the Mont Pelerin Society of Architecture. I think probably most of you know that the Mont Pelerin Society was a think tank that plotted and strategically put in place neoliberal economics. It is not the case that capitalism naturally and teleologically moved into this neoliberal sphere and market-driven economy. It was plotted by the Mont Pelerin Society. The Academy is the only place where we can plot the redirection of architecture. This isn't going to happen in the profession that is still working on project by project bespoke issues. The Academy is the one place where we can use our collective intelligence and put our resources to a new, changed architecture profession. So, finally, how do we organize this? And here I have 6 opinions and 6 thoughts. 1, how can we teach towards these multiple arenas and such diverse skills in the normal 3-year professional program? We don't. Or we don't do it in one school. We specialize. We stop competing for students. But we then share the knowledge that our different institutions can actually indulge and speculate on. We institute partnering. How this happens, I'm not sure. Conferences that are implemented yearly and are structured into the curriculum, rotating students and faculty, co-publishing. In any case, if we specialize, it's only for the advantage of the shared research that that specialization can produce. I think here about my experience when I went to a conference on technological innovation at Georgia Technology, where I could see that their explorations so vastly surpass what's happening in the schools on the East Coast that I know, where technology is mostly subscribed to how to teach BIM or Revit. It was incredibly impressive. On the other hand, I could also see the questions that the schools that I knew about and traditionally have asked, which have to do with subjectivity, democratic access to design, tailorization, the nature of work, the implementation of communities. Those questions were not being asked at the Georgia Institute of Technology within the conference that I saw. And it became a real question for me is how do we combine those 2 intelligences without in some way insisting that both do both only half-assed. So how does this work with our system of accreditation? Well, it probably doesn't. NAAB will be unhappy, but it can adjust. And it will adjust because those who are interested in a static, traditional, educational curriculum will eventually move on and be replaced by a younger generation who understands the multiple ways, the rhizomatic ways, the systemic ways in which architectural education needs to work. Again, it could be that NAAB's new role will be exactly to monitor the fact that we don't secure and pretend to own within a certain institution the knowledge it has produced, but it guarantees that it is shared and in some way infiltrates the academy as a whole. 3, and then licensing. NCARB. NCARB will balk. It will have a hard time quantifying and qualifying the boundaries of professionalism. I have to say this would probably be ironic, or it is ironic, inasmuch as licensing and state licensing is the mechanism that guarantees that the profession doesn't just serve itself, but serve society. And in fact, that's all that we're being asked to be able to do. But I can suggest the following. 1, there could be different degrees of licensure. This is actually what is being pursued now with the New Zealand Registration Board, which is, and is also something that, for example, is happening in aviation, which is different degrees of education, different types of education, and different experiences yield different types of licenses. Another way is no licensing at all. Again, I will think about the Swedish example. Inasmuch as they don't chase down who does and does not have a license, and according to what conditions, they spend their time on education and connecting those who practice architect to the community and to the government. Or 3, we can just refuse, which is to say we can never register, happily giving up the privilege of signing drawings for work that doesn't conform to arbitrary limits. 4, it requires activism, which is to say things will only change in our conservative discipline if we actually understand how actively this needs to change. I think here about the group that's called Just Transitions that's working on implementing exactly the way that we do transfer over to Green New Deal, and they recognize that if that transfer isn't done democratically with all the appropriate people at the table, the outcome itself is not going to be democratic, which is to say that we need to think about how that transition happens within the academy itself. It also means that those of us who in some way occupy a privileged position within the academy need to argue for all of those who don't. 5, it also means being optimistic about the outcome And here I think about geography and the fact that geography is a discipline that has basically transformed itself. Urban geographers like David Harvey embarrassed post-World War II about a discipline that had been aligned with global colonization, directed their expertise after World War II to local British urban issues. Geography then was alone in dealing with the urban issue, which means that it then infiltrated history, infiltrating history with its interest in urban history. It infiltrated economics, and it infiltrated politics, which is to say that in all these different disciplines, if they were thinking urbanism, geography had a central place. It also transformed the discipline in general to the one that we now recognize as largely Marxist in its issues and agendas. And 6, finally, we need to think dialectically. Change doesn't happen linearly or directly, and often one doesn't immediately recognize where change has actually taken place. We can lose a battle and still win a war. We can also think about the fact that if this approach to architecture education seems too instrumental and makes many people nervous, this one too will hopefully pass. Beaux-Arts tradition left behind an earlier rules-based functionality. We are suggesting replacing Beaux-Arts with the more activist and socialist and social-minded agenda. And ours will be replaced when society realigns and humanity has come to its senses. In the meanwhile, we have work to be done to get us to that place. Thank you.